The commercials that are used to recruit people to the United States Marine Corps have always intrigued me. Visually, those uniforms look pretty sharp, pretty enticing. The men and the women in the commercials are proud and strong and young. And the words of the commercial talk about a tough, demanding sort of service that is offered to them. There's little sugarcoating about the demands, the expectations, and the requirements. They are looking for just a few young men and young women. And that commercial certainly is to attract some and intended to weed out others with the question, is this really something that you find appealing, maybe even compelling? The remembered words of Jesus in Matthew's Gospel carry much of the same unvarnished reality. Come to me, all you that are weary and are carrying heavy burdens, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden light. Most of us don't know much about yokes. Our ancestors gave up oxen and yokes a long time ago, first of all for horses and then for tractors. Yokes belong in museums dedicated to old-fashioned, antiquated farm machinery. Tradition has it that Jesus grew up in a carpenter's shop, Joseph being a carpenter, perhaps with a workshop attached to the house. Most boys learned the craft and the occupation of their fathers, and so it follows that Jesus probably knew something about crafting a yoke. He knew the difference between a yoke that fits and one that doesn't, one that fits correctly and comfortably. Yokes by their nature are heavy, clumsy devices and are at their best when they are custom fitted to that particular animal, easing the burden on that animal. Well, the context for all this is the words of Jesus as he's being criticized by some in the crowd for being so different from John the Baptist. John the Baptist was this controversial person, an austere, fiery preacher of repentance or God's going to get you, living on the edge of civilized folk, paving the way, as it turned out, for Jesus and his own ministry. Most people thought that John the Baptist was too extreme, too stark, too much out of the mainstream. And they criticized him, and they criticized his followers and his message. It was too much for them. Jesus, they thought, was much more approachable. He mingled with people, he ate and drank with them, he socialized, but he also was being criticized for his ministry. And so in a sense, Jesus throws up his hands in disgust and says, people will never be pleased. Whether you do too much or too little, you're going to be criticized, whether you are the messenger or the message that you have to share. Be that as it may, there were some, a minority to be sure, who listened eagerly to what Jesus had to say, hanging on his words, trying to decipher the stories, the parables that he taught, finding both comfort and hope in this new preacher who had arrived on the scene. Those who were drawn to him tended to be poor people, people who had a lot to lose, not much to gain, disadvantaged folks, the have-nots of their time, those who labored in the shadows. Some of them were outcasts in the sense of being lepers or prostitutes or even tax collectors, not the usual ones that a committee would solicit for new members of an up-and-coming religious group. To them, the few who followed him, Jesus offered a yoke, a life of duty and obligation, but a life that would promise fulfillment and joy. Yes, it was to be a demanding life, to be sure, to follow the testing example of this Jesus. By the time Matthew wrote his gospel, the first persecutions organized against the Christians were taking place. It took a while before the Christians would stand out, would be differentiated from those who were worshiping Greek and Roman idols or fertility cults. It took a while before Christians were being differentiated between the Jews, with whom they were often confused. A Roman, perhaps reluctantly, once remarked, "Look at those Christians, how they love one another." How about that? Look at those Christians, how they love one another. Other Christians were impressed by the way those early Christians cared for women, for widows, for orphans, for children. The usual ones who didn't count because they weren't producers, they were takers, not givers, throwaways. And yet the Christians said they too are children of God. So those early Christians stood out by the way they lived, by the teachings of Jesus to love the neighbor, to love God, that forgiveness would be one of the distinctions that would make them different from other religious practices, forgiveness. And these Christians were to embrace life with all of its difficulties, but with all of its possibilities. Well, religious talk is cheap, costs relatively nothing, but religious living, doing, acting, having some skin in the game, would have some difficult consequences if, in fact, that's something you would choose. And so Jesus talked about an easy yoke. An easy yoke, which almost seems to be a contradiction in terms. How can a yoke be easy? Well, the yoke part of it is obvious to me. The Jesus way, as he pronounced it, as he went around teaching and preaching, was not the way the world in which he lived was approaching life. So that if the gospel way was going to be your way, it was going to be a lonely journey for many. Jesus was absolutely convinced that no human being was a throwaway. No human being was a no account. No human being was a nobody who could be discarded. Contrast that to our own time. We mostly live our lives with our tribal equals. I'm going to call us that. We live with our tribal equals, people like us. We tend to clump together in our comfort zones, supporting those that we identify as our kind, and being suspicious and even judgmental about those we decide are not our kind. We have come to accept hierarchies of importance of human beings, that there will be a few at the top of the pile, and the many below will make it all possible, and they ought to be satisfied with having at least something to contribute. The Apostle Paul, a follower of Jesus, reinforced this sense of gracious equality in the Christian life, how all people are to be gathered into God's grace. This comes from Galatians. Paul says, there's no longer Jew and Greek, no longer slave or free, no longer male and female, for all of you are one in Christ Jesus. If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. We're all together, says Paul. And some of that gracious acceptance of God's children rubbed off on us as we were forming a new nation. Remember those words from the Declaration of Independence? We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Sounds good. In 1776, that bold statement of equality in the colonies referred primarily to males who held property. Males who hold property. It did not include the poor. It did not include the landless. It did not include the slaves. It did not include women. All men. Men. And we are still living our way into those lofty ideals that have not yet been extended to all. The yoke Jesus asks us to carry is to extend God's gracious acceptance to all, into every aspect of our lives, to love God, to love the neighbor as we love ourselves, without conditions, without exceptions, without saying, yes, these, but not those. I think the culture around us, the one in which we grew up, and for the most part accept, teaches us to divide the human family into levels, into stratas of importance and worth, so that some are deemed to be more important, more worthy, others not so much. Having been in India, I know that there is still a de facto caste system in the country of India, pigeonholing people into narrow slots, limiting their status and opportunities. But friends, we are not immune to the same kind of mindset here. The justice system of this country is not blind to wealth and status. If you have wealth and status, you will be treated differently. Count on it. And if you don't, it'll be a different story. Women have not played on a level playing field in this country ever, and still not. Still not. Male white privilege is a reality. I've been a part of that my whole life and didn't know it. It's still with us. White male privilege. And if you aren't white and male, some of those privileges are not going to be yours. Distinctions like appearance and ethnicity and gender and sexual identity are used against other people all the time. It's a reality. And those realities ought to bother us. And when they do bother us, that is the Jesus yoke that he offers to us. When the haves are content to look down their noses on the have-nots, that ought to bother us. And that's the Jesus yoke. When the poor are pushed to the side, not even tolerated, that ought to bother us. And when it does, that is the Jesus yoke. And you see, the burden is ours because we know the difference. We know the teachings of Jesus. And that's the yoke we bear. But Jesus says that this yoke is easy, that the burden is light. How can that be? I can attest that in my own life I have been challenged more than once as I made a case for the equality of women. Now, it took me a while to believe that there was an inequality of women, but once my sister-in-law told me that was so, I have become an advocate for women's rights. And in some circles, that does not play very well. And it's true in the church. It's true in the church. I have been an advocate for the acceptance of gay and lesbian transgendered people, and that has not always played very well either. I have been an advocate for the fair treatment of persons of color and minorities. I've been an advocate for the open doors and open hearts for immigrants, people without official papers, being welcomed into our country as my four mothers and fathers were welcomed into this country, seeking a better life and a freer society. And the walls we talk about are, to me, an abomination. What is written on the Statue of Liberty, give me your tired, your poor, those are noble words. And we need to live our way into those. Now, if that is a yoke, if that is a burden, believing those kinds of things, for me it's an easy yoke. It is consistent with the Jesus I think I need to follow. This is what I know about the teachings of Jesus and how I think that is relevant for the life I live and maybe you live as well. Someone has said, if you know it, you own it. If you know it, you own it. To plead ignorance doesn't work for us, for we know better. This is Sunday morning gospel talk, Jesus talk that ought to be lived out in the rest of the week, and it often is, and I know that. This is consistent with what I believe to be the Jesus way lived out in families and in workplaces, yet to be lived out in interpersonal relationships, conversations with friends, challenging those who accept the prejudices and the biases that don't belong in the Jesus way. So I do believe the yoke is easy, even though it's hard, because it's the Jesus way. And it's our calling to lead a distinctive life, and to lead a distinctive life in a culture that has a different way of looking at things is not going to be easy. So may God bless you as you assume this life of promise, this Jesus way. You and I will live it imperfectly, to be sure, but it is a way of living it our way into our birthright, which is being a child of God, and extending that privilege to every other human being. Amen.